Welcome to this comprehensive examination of Yugoslav armored forces during the Second World War. When we discuss tank warfare in World War II, Yugoslav armor is often overlooked, yet the story of Yugoslav tanks and armored vehicles during this devastating conflict deserves recognition and study. Today we will explore the complete history of Yugoslav armor during World War II, a tale that begins with a small but determined effort to build armored forces in the 1930s, continues through the brief but desperate defense against the Axis invasion of April 1941, and extends to partisan forces using captured armor throughout the liberation struggle until 1945. Yugoslavia's position in the late 1930s was precarious. Surrounded by potentially hostile neighbors and recognizing the growing threat of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, Yugoslavia attempted to modernize its military forces. However, as a relatively poor agricultural nation with limited industrial capacity, Yugoslavia faced enormous challenges in building modern armored forces. The Yugoslav military had to purchase virtually all armored vehicles from foreign manufacturers, primarily from Czechoslovakia, France, and Britain, creating a small but diverse tank force. Yugoslav military planners understood that in any conflict with Germany or Italy, their small armored force would be hopelessly outnumbered and outgunned. Nevertheless, they believed that modern tanks were essential for any credible military defense. By April 1941, when Germany launched Operation Marita, the invasion of Yugoslavia, the Yugoslav army possessed approximately 110 tanks of various types, organized into several tank battalions. While this force was tiny compared to the hundreds of German panzers that invaded, Yugoslav tank crews fought with determination and courage during the brief campaign. After Yugoslavia's defeat and occupation, the story of Yugoslav armor did not end. Partisan forces captured and used various tanks throughout the Liberation War. Additionally, Allied powers provided some armored vehicles to Yugoslav partisan forces in the later stages of the war. Yugoslav tankers continued fighting, whether in the desperate defense of April 1941 or later with partisan forces and Allied-equipped units. Let us now examine the tanks that equipped Yugoslav forces, beginning with the light tanks that formed the backbone of Yugoslav armored capability. Light tanks. Renault FT-17. The Renault FT-17 was France's revolutionary World War I light tank, the first tank to feature a fully rotating turret and the classic tank configuration that would become standard. Yugoslavia acquired approximately 12 Renault FT-17 tanks in the 1920s, either through purchase or as part of post-World War I surplus sales. By 1941, these tanks were thoroughly obsolete, being over 20 years old and representing technology from a previous era of warfare. The FT-17 measured 5 meters in length, including the tail, 1.74 meters in width, and 2.14 meters in height. It weighed 6.5 tons and was powered by a Renault 4-cylinder gasoline engine, producing 39 horsepower, giving a maximum speed of only 7 kilometers per hour. The two-man crew consisted of driver and commander gunner. Yugoslav FT-17s were armed either with a 37mm Puto gun or an 8mm Hotchkiss machine gun, depending on the variant. Armor ranged from 8 to 22 millimeters, adequate against rifle fire, but vulnerable to any anti-tank weapon. By April 1941, Yugoslav FT-17 tanks were hopelessly obsolete. Their extreme age, slow speed, limited armament, and thin armor made them ineffective against modern German forces. Most Yugoslav FT-17s were relegated to training duties or static defense positions, where their lack of mobility was less critical. Some may have seen brief action during the April War, but their contribution was negligible. After Yugoslavia's defeat, German forces captured remaining FT-17s, though these obsolete vehicles held no value for the Wehrmacht. The FT-17's presence in Yugoslav service represented the challenge facing smaller nations trying to maintain armored forces with limited resources. These ancient tanks were essentially museum pieces pressed into service because Yugoslavia could not afford to replace them with modern vehicles. Renault R-35. The Renault R-35 was a French light infantry tank designed in the mid-1930s. Yugoslavia purchased approximately 54 R-35 tanks from France in 1938-1940, making it the most numerous tank in Yugoslav service. The R-35 represented a significant improvement over the ancient FT-17s and provided Yugoslavia with a relatively modern, if limited, tank capability. The R-35 measured 4.02 meters in length, 1.87 meters in width, and 2.13 meters in height. It weighed 10.6 tons and was powered by a Renault 82 horsepower gasoline engine, giving a maximum speed of only 20 kilometers per hour, painfully slow even by 1930s standards. Range was approximately 140 kilometers. The two-man crew consisted of commander, gunner, and driver, an arrangement that overloaded the commander with too many simultaneous duties. Armament consisted of a short 37mm SA-18 gun and a coaxial 7.5mm machine gun, both mounted in the small APXR turret. The 37mm gun could penetrate approximately 40 millimeters of armor at point-blank range, adequate against light tanks but insufficient against most medium tanks. The gun could fire both armor-piercing and high-explosive ammunition. Armor protection ranged from 10 millimeters on the rear to 45 millimeters on the frontal surfaces, providing reasonable protection against anti-tank rifles and light anti-tank guns, but vulnerable to dedicated anti-tank weapons. The R-35 featured several design compromises that limited its effectiveness. The extremely slow speed made tactical maneuvering difficult and made the tank vulnerable to being outflanked or overtaken by faster enemies. The two-man crew was insufficient, particularly the single-man turret that forced the commander to handle command, observation, gun laying, and ammunition loading simultaneously. The narrow tracks provided poor traction in soft ground. The vision devices were inadequate, limiting crew situational awareness. Despite these limitations, the R-35 represented Yugoslavia's most modern tank in significant numbers. Yugoslav tank crews trained extensively on these vehicles, developing proficiency in their operation and employment. Yugoslav military planners organized R-35 tanks into the 1st Tank Battalion and other units, intending to use them for infantry support and defensive operations. During the April 1941 invasion, Yugoslav R-35 tanks saw action against German forces. Tank crews fought with determination despite facing superior German armor and overwhelming odds. Several engagements occurred where Yugoslav R-35s engaged German Panzer IS, WWIIs, the IIIs, and IVs. The R-35's armor could occasionally withstand hits from German 37mm guns at longer ranges, but the slow speed prevented effective tactical maneuvering. Yugoslav R-35 crews achieved some local successes, destroying German vehicles and supporting infantry, but could not affect the campaign's overall outcome. The brief campaign lasted only 11 days from April 6 to April 17, 1941. Yugoslav resistance collapsed under the coordinated German, Italian, Hungarian, and Bulgarian invasion. Most Yugoslav R-35 tanks were destroyed in combat, abandoned due to mechanical failure, or captured by Axis forces. German forces pressed some captured R-35s into their own service or provided them to puppet regimes and allies. After Yugoslavia's defeat, some R-35 tanks fell into partisan hands. Yugoslav partisans used captured R-35s when possible, though the slow speed and mechanical fragility limited their utility in mobile guerrilla warfare. The R-35's contribution to partisan operations was minimal, as maintaining and supplying these French tanks without proper facilities and spare parts proved nearly impossible. Škoda LT Verzin 35. The Škoda LT Verzin 35 was a Czechoslovak light tank that represented one of Yugoslavia's more capable armored vehicles. Yugoslavia purchased approximately 8 LT Verzin 35 tanks from Czechoslovakia in the late 1930s, acquiring these modern, well-designed tanks just before Czechoslovakia's dismemberment by Germany. The LT Verzin 35 was also used by German forces after Czechoslovakia's occupation, designated Panzer 35T in Wehrmacht service. The LT Verzin 35 measured 4.90 meters in length, 2.06 meters in width, and 2.21 meters in height. It weighed approximately 10.5 tons and was powered by a Škoda T11 six-cylinder gasoline engine producing 120 horsepower, giving a maximum speed of 35 kilometers per hour. Range was approximately 190 kilometers. The four-man crew consisted of commander, gunner, loader, and driver, a more reasonable crew distribution than the R-35's two-man arrangement. Armament consisted of a 37mm Škoda A3 gun and two 7.92mm ZB-53 machine guns, one coaxial and one in the hull. The 37mm gun could penetrate approximately 40-50 millimeters of armor at reasonable combat ranges, making it effective against most light and medium tanks of the late 1930s. Armor protection ranged from 8 to 35 millimeters, with the frontal surfaces having the thickest armor. While not heavy, this armor provided reasonable protection against contemporary anti-tank weapons. The LT Vers 35 featured several advanced design elements for its era. The pneumatic power-assisted steering and braking systems were innovative, though they proved somewhat unreliable in Yugoslav service due to inadequate maintenance facilities and spare parts. The suspension provided good cross-country mobility. The four-man crew allowed better crew distribution of duties. The riveted construction was standard for the period, though this created the rivet spalling problem when impacted. Yugoslav LT Vers 35 tanks were organized into elite units and were considered the best tanks in Yugoslav service. Crews trained extensively on these vehicles and developed considerable proficiency. During the April 1941 invasion, Yugoslav LT Vers 35s saw action against German forces. The tank's performance and firepower allowed Yugoslav crews to engage German armor on somewhat more equal terms than the slow R-35 could manage. Several successful engagements occurred where Yugoslav LT Vers 35s destroyed German vehicles. However, the small number of LT Vers 35s in Yugoslav service meant they could not significantly impact the campaign. Most were eventually destroyed or captured during the 11-day war. German forces that captured Yugoslav LT Vers 35s added them to the substantial numbers already in Wehrmacht service from the occupation of Czechoslovakia. These captured tanks were used for training, security duties, or transferred to Allied forces. Carden-Loyd tankettes. Yugoslavia purchased a small number of British Carden-Loyd tankettes in the late 1920s or early 1930s, probably fewer than 10 vehicles. These tiny machine gun carriers represented early mechanization efforts, but were obsolete even by the mid-1930s. The tankettes weighed less than 2 tons and were armed only with a single machine gun. By 1941, any surviving Carden-Loyd tankettes in Yugoslav service were used only for training or had been scrapped. They would have been completely useless in combat against modern German forces. The Carden-Loyd's main historical significance was providing Yugoslav forces with early experience in tracked vehicle operation. Armored cars. Daimler MKI armored car. Yugoslavia possessed a limited number of British Daimler armored cars, probably fewer than 20 vehicles. These four-wheeled armored cars were designed for reconnaissance and cavalry support roles. The Daimler featured a rotating turret armed with machine guns, reasonable armor protection against small arms, and good road speed. Yugoslav Daimler armored cars served with cavalry units and reconnaissance formations. During the April 1941 invasion, these vehicles conducted screening operations and reconnaissance missions. The armored cars' speed allowed them to evade combat when necessary, though some were destroyed or captured during the brief campaign. Tatra OA Vers 30 armored car. Yugoslavia acquired approximately 10 Czechoslovak Tatra OA Vers 30 armored cars in the 1930s. This four-wheeled armored car was armed with a 37mm gun in a rotating turret and 1 or 2 machine guns. The Tatra featured reasonable armor protection and good cross-country capability for a wheeled vehicle. Yugoslav Tatra armored cars served in reconnaissance roles, providing mobile firepower and scouting capability. During April 1941, these vehicles conducted reconnaissance and security missions. The 37mm gun allowed engagement of light enemy vehicles. Though the thin armor made them vulnerable, most were eventually destroyed or captured during the invasion. Hork 901 armored car and others. Yugoslavia operated various other armored cars from multiple sources, including German, French, and Italian designs acquired through different channels. Most were elderly vehicles in limited numbers, serving with second-line units or in training roles. By 1941, most were obsolete and contributed little to combat capability. Tanks in Yugoslav service after initial defeat. German tanks captured by partisans. After Yugoslavia's defeat and occupation, partisan forces occasionally captured German armored vehicles. These included various Panzer models, particularly damaged or abandoned vehicles that partisans recovered and attempted to repair. However, the challenges of operating captured German tanks were enormous. Spare parts were unobtainable except through capture, ammunition had to be captured, fuel was scarce, and trained crews were rare. Yugoslav partisans occasionally used captured Panzer II, III, and I-4 tanks in operations. Some famous partisan commanders became known for boldly using captured armor in raids. However, these instances were exceptional rather than routine. Most captured German tanks were quickly immobilized by mechanical failure or lack of fuel and ammunition. The propaganda value of partisans using captured German tanks often exceeded their actual combat contribution. Italian tanks captured by partisans. Italian occupation forces in Yugoslavia used various Italian tanks including CV-33 tankettes, L-640 light tanks, and M1340 and M1441 medium tanks. Yugoslav partisans occasionally captured these vehicles, particularly after Italy's September 1943 surrender, when Italian units disintegrated and equipment fell into partisan hands. The Italian CV-33 tankette was occasionally used by partisans due to its simplicity and small size, which made it somewhat easier to conceal and maintain than larger tanks. However, the CV-33's light armament and thin armor limited its effectiveness. Italian medium tanks were more valuable when captured, but more difficult to maintain. Partisan use of captured Italian tanks was sporadic and limited by logistics challenges. Soviet tanks with Yugoslav forces. As the war progressed and Soviet forces advanced through Eastern Europe, Yugoslav partisan forces increasingly coordinated with the Red Army. Soviet forces provided some tanks and armored vehicles to Yugoslav units fighting alongside them. These included T-34 medium tanks, various light tanks, and armored cars. Yugoslav tank crews trained by Soviet advisors operated these vehicles during the liberation of Yugoslavia in 1944-1945. The presence of Soviet tanks and Soviet-trained Yugoslav crews represented a significant enhancement of partisan armored capability. However, the numbers involved were relatively small, as Yugoslavia's rugged terrain and poor infrastructure limited large-scale armored operations. British tanks provided to Yugoslav forces. Britain provided limited military equipment to Yugoslav partisan forces through liaison missions and supply operations. This included some armored vehicles, possibly including light tanks, armored cars, and other vehicles. However, British armored vehicle deliveries were limited by the difficulty of supplying forces in occupied Yugoslavia and by priority allocations to other theaters. Any British tanks or armored cars that reached Yugoslav partisans were used in operations supporting the liberation. However, the quantities were small, and the impact on overall partisan armored capability was limited. American tanks in Yugoslav service. American involvement in supplying Yugoslav forces included some armored vehicles delivered through various channels. This may have included M3 Stuart light tanks or other vehicles, though in very limited numbers. American-provided vehicles faced the same logistics challenges as equipment from other sources. Maintenance, spare parts, and fuel supply were constant problems. The story of Yugoslav tanks in World War II is one of determined resistance with inadequate means. Yugoslavia entered the war with a small armored force of approximately 110 tanks, mostly obsolete French Renault R-35s, with smaller numbers of Czechoslovak and other vehicles. This tiny force faced the German Wehrmacht's hundreds of panzers, supported by Italian, Hungarian, and Bulgarian armor. During the 11-day April 1941 campaign, Yugoslav tank crews fought with courage and determination, achieving tactical successes but unable to affect the strategic outcome. The Renault R-35, Yugoslavia's most numerous tank, proved slow and inadequate against German armor, though crews fought effectively within the tank's limitations. The Czechoslovak LT version 35 represented Yugoslavia's best tanks, but was too few in number to matter strategically. After occupation, Yugoslav partisans occasionally used captured Axis armor, achieving propaganda victories and local tactical successes despite enormous logistics challenges. The use of captured German and Italian tanks demonstrated partisan resourcefulness and courage, but could not create sustainable armored capability without industrial support. As the war progressed, Allied support and coordination with Soviet forces gradually provided Yugoslav units with more modern equipment. Yugoslav tank crews fighting alongside the Red Army in the liberation campaigns operated Soviet tanks, finally having adequate equipment after years of desperate improvisation. Yugoslav tankers deserve recognition for their courage and determination. They fought in obsolete tanks during April 1941, knowing they faced superior enemies but refusing to surrender without resistance. They captured and operated enemy vehicles during partisan operations, despite impossible logistics. They fought alongside Allied forces in the final liberation using Allied-provided equipment. Throughout, Yugoslav tankers maintained their honor and contributed to their nation's liberation. The Yugoslav experience demonstrates the challenges facing smaller nations attempting to maintain armored forces, limited resources, dependence on foreign suppliers, and the impossibility of competing with major powers in arms races created situations where courage and determination could not overcome material disadvantages. Yugoslav tankers understood these limitations, but fought nonetheless, writing a chapter of armor history that deserves remembrance. Thank you for joining us on this comprehensive exploration of Yugoslav tanks in World War II. From the obsolete Renault FT-17s to modern Czechoslovak LTVZ-35s, from desperate defensive battles in April 1941 to partisan improvisation throughout the Liberation War, Yugoslav armor history reflects determination and courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Yugoslav tank crews fought with honor, demonstrating that even small nations with inadequate equipment could resist tyranny and contribute to ultimate victory.